Hi, I'm John Wendt, a PhD student with the Paleoecology Lab at MSU. I'll be presenting my work on how bison responded to late Quaternary climate change. In addition to my advisor Dave McWethy, my co-presenters are Chris Wigga and Brian Schumann. This project was motivated by my interest in understanding the role of herbivores in long-term ecosystem dynamics. I created this animated map to understand how the ecological impacts of herbivores changed over the millennia. Bison are a perfect candidate to explore this topic because they are the largest terrestrial mammal in North America to survive through the Late Quaternary and because they're abundant in the fossil record. The patterns you see here are generated more questions than answers, however. It is clear from the distribution patterns and body size changes that bison have experienced dramatic changes since the last glacial maximum. Which brings me to the research question that I will be exploring today. How has climate change influenced the distribution and abundance patterns of bison since the last glacial maximum? So first I want to set the stage with a couple of concepts that will help frame the analysis going forward. First is the basic relationship between precipitation and herbivore abundance. As precipitation increases, so does forage availability and forage production, and that tends to result in greater abundance and greater populations of grazers. Then the second concept is perhaps less familiar, but Jeff Martin here has a couple interesting studies looking at the relationship between temperature and body mass of bison, both over millennial scales and decadal scales. And in both cases, bison body size is shown to decrease with rising temperatures. This is connected to the heat dissipation limitation theory, which states that the maximum energy expenditure of endothermic animals is limited by their ability to dissipate heat and avoid hypothermia. So based on those relationships that I just discussed, we wanted to explore how bison responded to precipitation changes and temperature changes in the past. We expected bison abundance to respond positively to increased forage and moisture availability as long as habitats were open. And we also expected that bison underwent thermal stress, and this thermal stress both drove changes in body size and changes in distribution. So to test these hypotheses, I took the raw data from the initial animated map that was downloaded from the Neotoma Paleoecology database and transformed them into two data sets, one to indicate changes in abundance between 1,000-year intervals and another one to show changes in bison distribution at 1,000-year intervals. So the goal of the abundance dataset is to show the directionality of change in the number of bison sites between two 1,000-year time intervals. I don't have time to explain exactly how this works, but just note that the end product is a spatial grid that shows whether there was an increase or a decrease or no change in the number of bison sites within a given area. And the distribution models were produced with Maxent, a machine learning algorithm. And as predictors, we used climate variables from Trace 21K climate simulation. We started with 17 initial climate variables and narrowed that down to 7 variables based on the selection criteria outlined here. So I'll quickly walk through the abundance changes that we see in our data set. Not a lot happening up until the Holocene-Pleistocene transition, where we start to see some regional changes in bison abundance, especially decreases in the south, southeast, and southwest, and increases tend to be concentrated in the Rocky Mountains or along the margins of the receding ice sheet. By the late Holocene, we start to see a real, trend towards increases regionally, especially in the Rockies, in the Intermountain West, and in the Great Plains. So here's what that looks like summarized over one plot. Each of these intervals here corresponds to a map, and these bars correspond to the number of cells that indicate a particular color or direction. So here, this 19 to 18 interval represents increases with respect to the previous interval, 20 to 19. We also have a line here just to count the number of sites over time. So this is a way to visualize perhaps at least the extent of bison abundance changes. So more blue bars, larger blue bars would mean that the extent of bison site increases is larger, and then red bars corresponds to decreases. So we have decreases at their height in the early Holocene, and we have increases at their heights during the late Holocene. And here are some select intervals from the species distribution model as well. The blue cells, anything above this probability threshold, those indicate predicted presences for bison, and the model is trained on the black dots, and the predictor variables are not visible on the maps, but they are the climate variables that were selected. So you see with the changing blue distribution over time, you see shifts in the predicted distribution of bison. So these figures here are based on the species distribution model for bison. What this is basically summarizing the climate experienced by bison here in the blue, with the blue line being the median and the shaded area being the interquartile range. This is compared against the typical North American climate, which includes all ice-free area used in the analysis. So, and then the variable rank is simply for a given time interval, how important was this variable for predicting the distribution of bison? As you can see here, the annual mean temperature was a very important variable for predicting bison distribution for the past 15,000 years. And you can also see just how much annual mean temperature experienced by bison diverged from the median continental climate. Annual precipitation and other precipitation variables are shown here. You can see that annual precipitation was important for predicting the distribution of bison, especially for about the first 8,000 years of this study, so between 20 and 12,000 years ago. And you can also see that the precipitation experienced by bison used to be much higher than the typical continental climate, but over the course of time, those two values have basically converged. So to summarize our data and analysis, over the past 20,000 years, the geographic distribution of bison went from regionally clustered to contiguous and kind of clumps in the Great Plains and Northern Rockies. The abundance of bison followed kind of regional patterning trends, especially since the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, where the greatest declines were at that transition and the greatest increases were experienced during the late Holocene. And the top variables for predicting the distribution of bison were annual precipitation between 20 to 15,000 years ago and mean annual temperature between 15,000 years ago to present. Also, we saw the bison climate niche was gradually narrowing over time. So a couple of takeaways. We do think that both of our hypotheses are supported. Bison abundance does increase where and when moisture is high, and the opposite is also true. And thermal stress experienced by bison did appear to drive shifts in their distribution and body size dynamics. So bison climate it's not the same as your typical North American climate, and that has implications for how we think about and understand the influence of climate change on these species, which may experience climate change far different than what we might just average over the entire continent. Also, bison were transformed by climate change. Rising temperatures and declining body sizes between 19,000 and 9,000 years ago to us imply that bison were experiencing thermal stress. So, and a quick thank you to my advisory committee and my lab mates and our funders.